this is the latest in a series of talks organised by John Mayne's Tours, which is encouraging us all to really be armchair travellers and to use lockdown as a way of studying, as a way of learning, and perhaps planning some of our travel in the future. So for my talk this evening, we are going to be focusing on the Riviera, and in particular, the beautiful Italian Riviera. And I'm going to be talking about the impact of the Riviera on three of the most famous Victorians: Florence Nightingale, Charles Dickens, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And as well as looking at the impact of Italy on their life, we're going to be looking specifically on the impact on their health as well, and how it influenced their work as we go along. And after we've looked at the impact of Italy on those three famous Victorians, we're going to be looking at something that's close to all of our hearts, and that is how the Victorians dealt with quarantine. And we'll have a little think about whether that's different from our quarantine restrictions today. So to start off, we have here a picture of people perhaps leaving Dover. And just to start off with a few facts and figures. Now, the most obvious way of us tracing the explosion of tourism from Britain across to particularly to southern Europe is by counting the number of people leaving the British ports. So, for example, in the 1830s, there was only 50,000 British people leaving British ports. But by 1913, it had increased to 660,000. So this is an incredible number of people who are leaving. And of course, some of these travellers would have been travelling for work. They might have been bureaucrats, they might have been tradesmen, they might even have been missionaries, but a fair old chunk of them would have been tourists. And the majority of Victorian tourists were travelling for their health. So they weren't like us, they weren't unabashed in their search to have a little bit of sunshine away from Britain. They either sought out culture or they sought out a way of improving their own health. So we would have peers of the realm, we would have royalty, cabinet ministers, and they would all travel down to southern Europe, almost forming sort of informal communities. And this wouldn't be something that they would do just once. They, as their Georgian grandparents might have done for their grand tour. It's something that they would do annually on a regular basis. As the century progressed, travel became quicker, it became much cheaper, and therefore more and more people were able to do this and to visit the beautiful Mediterranean shores. So starting off at the beginning of the 19th century, in the days before the railways, such distances were really not undertaken lightly. We're talking about a big commitment of time. So to get from London to Rome, depending on the weather, would take between 3 or 4 weeks. And interestingly, this is exactly the same amount of time as it would have taken in the Roman Empire. And this is because the method of travel was exactly the same. It was horsepower, and horses haven't really changed all that much. So the most comfortable way to travel, of course, is by private coach, by having your own coach that you could have set out the way you wanted to. And certainly the wealthier families that we'll be looking at this evening would have travelled in that way. And you could set it up almost as a home from home. You could have little cupboards, tables, your own ornaments, ways to amuse you, to while away the long and boring days. But one glimpse into travelling conditions by coach that did amuse me was recounted by John Ruskin's young wife, Effie, who was waiting at a coaching inn in Boulogne, and she was watching another English family who'd stayed overnight in the coaching inn and were getting ready to depart. And she said, she described this other family by saying, they're just setting off with 4 horses, 2 cages full of canary birds, and a fat, sick dog in a basket. And I have to say, if I was going to nominate the lowest rung of enjoyment, it would be spending weeks on end trapped in a carriage with a fat, sick dog in a basket. For those unable to travel in their own private coach, which you'd have set out just as you wanted it to be, the best alternative is to travel by public coach, which was known as a diligence. And this was not an ideal option. A Victorian surgeon, Dr. James Johnson, travelled back through France in 1829, and he described diligences as locomotive prisons, in which the traveller is pressed, prodded, and what's worst of all, poisoned with mephitic gases and noxious exhalations. So again, it's this reminder of the interest in the spread of infection and the spread of germs that even the early Victorians, though they wouldn't of course have called it germs, that they had during this time. Of course, by the time you get to the 1850s, you have the railway line going from London as far as Marseille. And it was possible to travel from Paris to Marseille in 18 hours, which, considering the weeks that this would have taken before, must have been fairly mind-blowing. By 1869, the line had got as far as Monaco, and by the following year, it had got down to the Italian border. But again, if we look back at the personal memoirs of the medical practitioners of the time, we can see this concern with the spread of infection in this time, and particularly in the dirty environment. Dr. Stuart Tiddy, who was travelling south by train in 1899, just says that the best thing to do is to just submit to being begrimed, just to being absolutely filthy dirty. He recommends carrying a wet sponge in an India rubber bag and every so often sponging the worst of it off your hands and feet, and trying to be reasonably hygienic during that time. As a way of perhaps combating the unseen infection that might be lurking in this enclosed space, he recommends carrying an atomizer, and every so often that would contain various things like menthol, eucalyptus, and every so often spraying some inside your nose and inside your mouth. Now, one family who could afford to travel in style were the Nightingales. William, Fanny, and their two teenage daughters, Parthenope and Florence. Now, of course, Florence herself needs no introduction. Many of you have heard both myself and Janice Liversidge give talks about Florence before. As you know, she almost single-handedly reformed nursing education in this country and public health in Britain. And I often say that second only to Queen Victoria, she's the second most famous woman in Britain at that time. But when we think of her in terms of travel, we tend to think of her in the battlefields of the Crimea, or of course in the British base hospital in Istanbul. And I know some John Maynes travellers have attended tours to Istanbul to travel in the footsteps of Florence Nightingale. But I think for the purposes of this talk, it's worth us remembering how important the role of Italy was in Florence's life. It played a really crucial part in developing her thought, not least because it was the country of her birth. When I'm talking to school children, I sometimes say that I'll give a prize to those who can guess the Italian city where Florence was born. Her family were so rich that following their marriage, they took an extended tour around Europe, and returning to England after several years with two tiny daughters. So when the girls were nearing marriageable age themselves, incidentally, Florence is the sister who's looking down at her sewing and is carefully averting her gaze. So when you have these two beautiful, marriageable age girls, the family decided to return to the Riviera, to France and to Italy, partly just for reasons of improving their general health, but also they were having extensive refurbishments done of their main family house. And this was, it was a sensible time for them to be away from home. And going back to the luxury of having your own carriage, Nightingale's father actually designed himself the insides. So it was tailor-made, their carriage, to fit out for all of his family's needs. But despite this, it was a long and tedious journey. And Parthenope wrote in her diary, which made me smile. I think any of us who get grumpy on long journeys will identify with this. She said, "We have some of us been rather cross and disagreeable. I do not mention names." On arriving in Florence, they took rooms at the Albergo dell'Arno, which is a beautiful former palace with views of the Ponte Vecchio. Now, what makes this trip of note is not the lovely dances that the girls attended in Nice. It's the fact that the way that we can really see Florence's mind developing. So they were doing sightseeing, of course, as good Victorians did, but the way that she captured what she saw, Parthenope, who was very artistic, sketched what she saw, but Florence collected facts. Even then, her early interest in medicine led her to visit and take notes on a school that was cared for children with disabilities in Genoa. And she also went to other religious and educational organisations. Now, of course, we know that Florence didn't follow the route that was expected of her, as all young women of her class, which was to get married. Instead, she was still obviously living at home in her mid to late 20s, well past marriageable age at that stage, and living an incredibly restrictive life. So we have to remember that this was a young woman who was very intelligent, very energetic, healthy, and just pottering around in her parents' home was pretty grim. Not surprisingly, she sunk into a depression, and the family were concerned enough to call a doctor. He felt that she had slow circulation and a tendency to depression of spirits, and this would only be cured by something that would make life interesting and cheerful. And for a Victorian, this meant only one thing: it meant Rome. But again, on this trip, we can see her visiting local hospitals, regaining not just her physical and mental health, but also regaining her passion and her interest for what we would now call public health. Importantly, it was on this visit in the early 40s that she met one of the most important people in her life, the Minister for the Cabinet of War, later became the Minister for the Cabinet of War, Sidney Herbert, and his wife Liz. And he became a very important figure in her life and helped her. They worked very closely together with caring for the soldiers in the Crimean War. And interestingly, we can see Sidney Herbert's love of Italy in rebuilding his local church. And this, I think, is a really stunning church. It looks like it's on the hills of Verona or somewhere like that. It's actually in Wiltshire. It's just outside Salisbury. And if you are in that neck of the woods, when restrictions allow it, it's well worth a visit. It is just like stepping into an Italian church. It's quite funny. So if Sidney Herbert brought Italy back to Victorian Britain, a gentleman who did the absolute opposite can be seen in the form of Charles Dickens. And it's interesting to look at his diaries about his travels in Italy, because his peculiar style of observation gives us an entirely different slant into what it was to be a travelling British man in Italy at this time. So, for example, he gave the guide in Naples the nickname of Mr. Pickle of Portici, and described, when looking at the Italian Alps, as an antediluvian 12th cake. So still thinking about Christmas, even when he's looking at the hills. When viewing, and this I think is the most shocking, when viewing Rome from a distance, his remark is that it looks like London. And so far was his enthusiasm and his passion for London that I think it clouded what he could see. But perhaps, or maybe even because of Dickens's habit of taking Dickensian London everywhere he went, it makes his interpretation of Italy of a special interest to us. Back home, his passionate interest in health reform and social care spills into his literature and his work, as we know. But it was in Italy that he was to dabble in the role of being a healer himself. So when in Italy, the Dickens family were usually based in Genoa, which was chosen specifically for its healthy climate. And they stayed in the Palazzo Pashia A, which was named for the two goldfish ponds, and you can nearly just see them in the beginning of the front of this slide we have here. So two goldfish ponds were at the front of this beautiful palace. And Dickens describes it as an enchanted palace in an Eastern story, and describes the statues, walkways, fountains playing, and walkways of lemon trees and olive trees. It was also haunted, so his dreams were disturbed by phantoms and by visions that came to him in the night. I mean, it wasn't just Dickens who said it was haunted. It was apparently known that there was a ghost. But we wonder perhaps if Dickens's sleep was disturbed by his current enthusiasm, which was hypnotism and mesmerism. This was something that he was extremely keen on. Mesmerism, very popular indeed at the end of the 18th century. And this was the belief that the powers of the body could be controlled by an invisible fluid. Now, this was completely debunked by the medical profession from the 1830s onwards. But the practice of hypnotism as a cure for mental unease leads directly into the birth of psychoanalysis some decades later. Dickens, by all accounts, was an absolute champion hypnotist. He once claimed that he could hypnotize a frying pan. I'm not actually sure that that's particularly impressive. I'm fairly sure I could hypnotize a frying pan, but it was something that he genuinely could do very, very effectively. It was one of his party tricks. He used to do it at parties. His boundless self-confidence led him to curing his friends of their symptoms through hypnotism. So moving back to Italy, the Dickenses met Augusta de la Rue, who was the English wife of a Swiss banker in Genoa in 1844. Now, Augusta was a highly nervous woman. She had facial tics. She had problems eating and sleeping. She also believed that she was pursued by a phantom. Dickens decided that he could cure her of her hysterical symptoms through a course of hypnotism, which ended up lasting for several months. Now, it's worth noting that Dickens's form of hypnotism took a highly intimate interpretation, shall we say. One method was to stroke the patient's eyebrows with both of his thumbs, and another is to breathe gently into her face as a way of waking her from a trance. Now, according to his diaries, he hypnotized Augusta, and I quote, sometimes under olive trees, sometimes in vineyards, sometimes in the travelling carriage, sometimes at wayside inns during the midday halt. Now, it's unsurprising that his irate wife eventually put a stop to this fun that was happening all over the Italian Riviera. But what's really remarkable is that Dickens actually appears to have been fairly successful in his treatment by encouraging Augusta to talk about her fears, by relaxing her, by reassuring her. But in particular, the discussing of dreams, the talking things through. I think we can arguably see Dickens's experiments with hypnotism as a really early form of the talking cure, free association, a dream analysis. Of course, it was to sweep Europe decades later, the publication of Freud's lectures, The Interpretation of Dreams, in 1899. This was 55 years after Dickens's unconventional treatment of Augusta de la Rue. Now, it would be impossible to talk about the Victorians in Italy and to miss out Elizabeth Barrett Browning, possibly the most famous invalid of the 19th century. The eldest of 9 children, she was especially close to her domineering father following the death of their mother. And from her teenage years, she had palpitations of the heart, chronic fatigue, pain, inability to bear extremes of hot and cold. Modern diagnosis has included, obviously we won't know, but suggestions of everything ranging from TB to polio to anorexia nervosa, ME. It could have been any of a variety of things, but whatever the physical or mental origin of her ailments, she was definitely very dependent on opium to dull her pain. And it was through her poetry that she was introduced to her fellow poet and distant cousin Robert Browning, and there followed a clandestine correspondence that had to be secret because her father had a pathological determination that none of his children should ever marry. Now, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's father has been in previous years dismissed as being purely authoritarian, but recent research has suggested that Mr. Barrett might have had another reason for his refusal to allow any of his children to marry. The Barrett family had historically been mainly based in Jamaica. They had their wealth from the plantations over there. But this is where they got their money from. And the Barrett family were what we would now call dual heritage, so mixed British and Jamaican. And as we know from programmes such as Who Do You Think You Are, this was not at all unusual in families who've been based in another country for generations. But it was something that perhaps wasn't often talked about. So in the 1840s, this could have been a reason for Mr. Barrett's determination that none of his children should marry and he should not have grandchildren. It wasn't unusual for Victorian parents to forbid daughters to marry, particularly the youngest one, who they might want to stay at home and look after them in their old age. But it was very unusual, possibly unique, to actually forbid your sons to marry as well. So that's something to think about there. So happily for them, the poetic pair eloped from Wimpole Street and went to Pisa, finally settling in Florence. And we don't know whether it was a warmer climate or cutting back on the laudanum or just the healing powers of love, but Elizabeth perked up no end, I'm happy to report. And despite being in her early 40s, had a fairly healthy son in 1849. And she herself went on to live for another 15 years, which was something that the doctors were not expecting. Her tomb was designed by Lord Leighton, and that's in the English Cemetery in Florence. And her son, who we can see pictured here, went on to be a fairly successful painter. And as an adult, he lived in one of those beautiful crumbling palazzos on the Grand Canal in Venice, which I think is a suitably romantic home for the son of two such great poets. So as we've looked at the 3 Victorians and their impact on the impact of Italy on their work, I just wanted to end up by looking a little bit at a subject that's very close to our heart at the moment, that of quarantine. So how did the Victorian travellers, the Victorian doctors and medics that we've been looking at, how did they cope with the quarantine restrictions? The answer is not very well. They found it extremely annoying. So far from being grateful that efforts are being made to try and keep everybody safe, letters of that period are filled with grumbles at the restrictions, particularly the badly thought out and inconsistent restrictions, the fears of the plague, typhoid, cholera. One of the few effective ways, as we know only too well, without a cure or a vaccine, is isolation. One method that was popular at the time as a way of avoiding quarantine was to strip naked and to bound through a room that was full of disinfecting steam, and meanwhile your clothes and belongings would separately be disinfected and eventually handed back to you. And we can only hope that they gave them a towel while they were waiting for their belongings to be returned to them. For those with a less robust attitude to stripping off and leaping through a steam bath, the only solution was to spend often 2 weeks in quarantine. And interestingly, one side of this, apart from the boredom and the isolation and the irritation of being cooped up, was to turn the most robustly cheerful person into a quivering hypochondriac. And this is beautifully described in the second chapter of Dickens's work, Little Dorrit, when poor Mr. Meagles is kept outside Marseille for a fortnight. He says, "I am like a sane man shut up in a madhouse. I can't stand the suspicion of the thing. I came here as well as I ever was in my life, but to suspect me of the plague is to give me the plague. I've been waking up night after night saying, now I've got it, now I'm in for it," which I have a lot of sympathy for, because I suspect that I'm not the only person who wakes up in the night at the moment thinking, do I feel a bit ill? So as always, Dickens is an amazing student of human nature. So to conclude, the Victorians' love of Italy is something that surrounds us in our culture today. And through their love, we can actually learn perhaps a bit more about their work and about their preoccupations. We've learned about the long and tedious journeys that they underwent. And I think even us keen travellers might think twice about the length and the uncomfortable nature that these travellers underwent. But and this is something to remember, that they didn't just do it once; they would often do it annually. They were so keen to travel, and of course risking long and irritating time in quarantine every time they made the journey. So what's I think important about my talk this evening is looking at the impact that Italy had on, in particular, Dickens and Nightingale's health reforms. And I think we can see the impact of the country, hopefully I've shown it this evening, weaving through the later work when they came back to Britain. So although the development of the Riviera happened very much as a place of people seeking to improve their own health, I would like to argue that its importance for us today is the way that Italy inspired health reform and stimulated those who were to lead the charge to improve public health in Victorian Britain. Thank you very much indeed.